Hello, and welcome once again to the next installment of The Long Scroll. And today we are going to speak with Sophia here about the nature of networks of klipot, which are the associative clusters that support and substantiate the perception of beings in their realms, regardless of what register those realms fall to. If you are a self-identified being and perceive yourself as separate, then you can inhabit myriad realms of various levels of subtlety where phenomena is processed according to dualistic associations, dualistic laws and rules. To break out of that dualism is the purpose of the great work, is the purpose of the pursuit of gnosis. Having said this, there is a great implication here, which is that every register of reality that is known by a conventional being is essentially a network of klipos. Klipos are associative compounds. They are mental constructs. And as we said in the last installment of the Long Scroll, they are manufactured by a compounding pressure between an inner designation and an outer designation. What I'm going to add to that today is something really quite radical. If you are creating a klipa, and what is inside the klipa becomes a designated meaning for you. It becomes a thing. It could become a substantial thing, meaning some sensory identification of a solid object that your senses perceive. It could be a designated point of location in space, or a coordinate point of location in time, or a concept, which could be an emotional impulse or an idea, an abstraction of some sort. Or it could be the very notion of beingness itself as what you grasp to as that which seems real. In other words, all of these types of reality that become mental constructs for beings are manufactured by reification. Reification is the root of dualistic interactions. It is that compounding action. So when some phenomena in any of these registers becomes real to you, you've created a klipa and sealed some limited sense of meaning in a little mental package. We already know this. I'm just restating what I said last time. But beyond that is infinite space. Beyond the designated construct is the infinite possibility of other klipas. And from the standpoint of knowing reality only by virtue of the fact of making mental associations, you have a bias towards knowing things through this compounding action, which changes the nature of all the space around each klipa that you make. Because what it does is it seals the inside of the klipa with specificity, but it also imposes on the infinite expanse around the klipa the capacity to make other klipas that operate according to similar laws. So what you are doing, in a sense, is creating space as a possibility for this compounding activity, which changes the nature of space. It reifies the nature of space. It makes space knowable only from the standpoint of what can fit inside a mental package. And if you impose this on the expanse of possibility, you reify that expanse as well. So not only are you reifying what's inside of every mental package, you're reifying the expanse around every mental package. Now, since that expanse of possibility can create a klipa out of anything, any position in space or moment in time, any idea that arises that could qualify a particular attribute or quality of some sort, the potential for making klipas out of open possibility becomes infinite. So you have, in essence, around every mental construct, a solid mass of possibility, a solid mass of potential reification. And this is why the making of a klipa, even a single klipa, is always involved in a chain reaction, because it changes the way that open space is perceived and prevents open space from actually being open. Space is just waiting for another klipa to be formed so something else can be known by the conceptual mind. Does this make sense, Sophia, so far?
Yeah. Especially when you talk about things in terms of transparency and opacity, this really kind of drives that home.
Well, what I'm talking about here is obviously what's sealed inside of each klipa construct becomes opaque. But what I'm implying here is that that activity of knowing things in that way makes space itself opaque as well.
So why exactly is it that the klipas happen in chains and these compound matrices instead of one at a time?
That's what we're going to get to next. That's
Okay.
the question that we're going to address here. Klipas, in a sense, cannot actually appear singularly. They always appear in clusters, because every kind of mental association is the attribution of some limited meaning to a package that the mind forms in order to grasp it or know it, because it's conforming to the limitations that have been set. If you think about the nature of associations, they don't exist singularly, because any association, conceptual association that you could come up with is only a type of association that is shared between you and other beings. For example, if you think of a lamp and you see a lamp, the specificity of that lamp that you think is unique because you're sitting right in front of it and directly perceiving it with your senses. But what makes it a lamp and what gives it its meaning is actually overlapping with every other lamp with all the other similar qualities that go on and on and on into infinity that other beings perceive. And the semiotic and linguistic associations of what is lamp, what does lamp mean, what does lamp do, which is give light, it's a physical object, it sits in a room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every single one of these qualities spins off into both general and specific implications that are shared by other beings throughout the realm. And we'll get into what I mean by that in a second. But there is what we could call a superpositioning of your perception of reality in relation to links to other related associations that go into the composite of what you're dealing with. You see that specific lamp, but it relates to all the lamp qualities and all the attributes of lamps and all the other lamps that have been perceived, on and on and on into infinity. So your little perception of your lamp is just like a little inlet of an endless ocean of lamp associations. And there are infinite qualities in every single perception that do this. So whenever you form a klipa of a sense perception or an idea or moment in time or location in space, you're always overlapping with similar related associations that are used in different ways. Some of them make sense and you see them. Other ones are hidden and you don't see. They're all interpenetrating each other, and for the most part are not obstructed from each other. In other words, your lamp and my lamp, even sitting in the same room, are not quite the same. We could be looking at the same so-called physical lamp, and you're perceiving something that is slightly different than what I perceive. The two perceptions are not obstructed from each other. but they're interpenetrating each other because we're having an experience that connects in a relationship. We're looking at the so-called same thing, but in different ways. Now compound that and amplify that by infinite implications of all the qualities that are involved, woven into this complex perceptual relationship that relate to every aspect of every part in every other possible way. In other words, there is an infinite amount of associations that are overlapping in this one klipa. In other words, this one klipa is overlapping with infinite other klipas at all times. This is evidence of the fact that space itself is a solid mass of possibility when it comes to the manufacture of klipas. We think we see things singularly. We think we see things with the subjective lens of simplicity. But what we are actually doing is participating in an infinite, overlapping, interpenetrating, mutually non-obstructing ocean of associative clusters. And this produces that solid mass of possibility that exists within the dualistic framework. Now, the amazing thing about this is that the mind can't see it. The mind thinks it sees only what it sees. It doesn't understand the ocean of associative activity that it actually lives in. Everything about the life and the mind and the perception of a conventionally fixated being is a klipa network. Everything. Its sense of space, its sense of time, its sense of conceptual meaning, its sense of itself, the very act of perceiving exists in this solid block of potential klipas. And the mind can't see it. And this is the actual reasoning behind the famous Zen koan, which you used to hear all the time in the 60s. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, nothing, because the hand can't clap against itself. Another one is a knife can't cut itself, right? If you're dealing with the pure singularity of awareness, right, there's a huge difference between that and the dualistic implications that are implied by consciousness and its perception. The mind cannot see itself. The hand cannot clap against itself. The knife cannot cut itself. So when you ask this question in the dualistic framework, the answer is confounding. It's nothing. It's unanswerable. Just like your seemingly singular window onto phenomena seems so solid and so real and so clear, it can't actually see what it's participating in, which is this infinite barrage, this solid mass of possibility, interpenetrating, mutually non-obstructing, superpositioned relational links within klipa networks that go on forever. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by mutually non-obstructing?
Well, if you have two klipas that relate to each other, they relate to each other in ways that either make sense or don't make sense. For example, back to the lamp. You and I are both looking at the same lamp, but we're seeing it in different ways. Our klipas that are formed in perception of the lamp are different from each other. They have subtle nuanced differences that pertain to your mind and my mind as having slightly different qualities. But they occupy the same space. We could be sitting in the same room looking at the same lamp and yet having totally two different klipas configured to what we think the lamp actually is in the same place. So the two klipas are not obstructing each other. They can both exist freely in the space because it's not a physical space. Space is actually not a physical thing. So you could have an infinite superpositioned density of possible klipas without needing to change position. Each klipa doesn't knock out the other klipa. They can occupy in a superposition fashion without negating each other. There's an infinite number of possibilities that it could exist in every so-called coordinate point. So they are mutually non-obstructing. They don't obstruct each other. For example, you could perceive the lamp and I could perceive the lamp, and they're different, but mine doesn't knock out yours and yours doesn't knock out mine. The parts that overlap, that are the same, interpenetrate each other, and we could even talk about it. For example, I could say, Sophia, do you see the lamp? You say, yes, I see the lamp. I say, well, it's blue and it has a round base. And you say, ah, yes, I see it. Because of the interpenetrating overlap, we can talk about similar qualities, but there's an infinite number of subtle qualities that not only make it impossible for us to compare and contrast, but we ourselves are not even aware of the implications of what the attributes are that are involved in the making of this construct. We have a very simplified view of this mutually non-obstructing, interpenetrating klipa that we think is reality. It actually goes on forever. So it's permeable.
So you could potentially talk about different layers of klipa making and klipa habit, from something that's a little more clear and obvious, like we're both seeing blue, but our blues are slightly different, versus we're both also making the klipa that the lamp exists in time and space, and that would be an example of a more subtle subconscious klipa.
Well, when you say the word subconscious, if you mean that which lies beyond the register of our perceivable experience, then yes, the majority of the overlap of the superpositioned associative clusters is beyond the framework of our perception, either mine or yours or any other being within a realm. As a matter of fact, that's what defines the realm. There are two principles here that go into this process, a general one and a specific one. On the general level, there are shared guidelines of the collective habit of the realm. For example, the habits that I have that can be shared with you and all other human beings in the human realm, and we agree. For example, when we look at a lamp, on the solidity, on the scale, on the position, on the various qualities on a gross level. But on a specific level, they're unique to each individual mind. And most beings who operate within a realm are only just marginally outside of the general agreed upon laws of that realm. The specific subtleties are far too subtle for most minds to even perceive. But if you really had a look at what makes my lamp different from your lamp, you would see registers of rasas or feeling tones and nuances that are so subtle that language can't even really describe them, but they're there. The differences in the specific that deviate from the general are wildly subtle and don't conform to language at all. So on the general level, we could say we all agree on a reality, and it's material and it's subtle, and yet we have ideas, but they're heavy, thick ideas that can be shared through our language, and we can go to universities and discuss them with each other and get very specific about our observations and conjectures about reality. And we think that's the whole of it because we have a general agreement based on empirical data, observed data, and the conclusions drawn from observation. This is nihilistic materialism, essentially, which gets quite subtle in the sciences and so forth. What eludes that view, which is based on the general laws of the realm, are the specifics of the individual mind and the subtleties of the act of perceiving within consciousness. This is where you cannot go into a university and discuss these things, because even in a philosophy context, you will be accused of just merely giving subjective data that could not be proven. All right, so your subjective data would be seen as too subjective to compare and to contrast with within the general, and generally would be written off as sort of an artistic, creative take that doesn't really matter to the collective. Because the general is always coming back to the collective. So hopefully that answers your question as to the interpenetrating, mutually non-obstructing superpositioning of the Klipa networks, the associative clusters. Are we all good on that so far?
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like some high level physics, but yet not. Some quantum mysticism.
Well, the term superpositioning, I definitely borrowed from the quantum language. I don't know anything about quantum physics at all. What I'm talking about is that solid block, that solid mass of possibility that exists when beings manifest dualistic habits. We want to make klipas out of everything. So even open space is just a solid mass of dualistic possibilities for any phenomena to arise and enter into a relationship that has an inner part and an outer part. So it opacifies space itself.
Why is it that beings come up with the collective agreements that they do? You know, why is it that we wind up with this specific collective experience that is generally agreed upon as opposed to something else?
Habit is general habit, and within the general habit are a bunch of specific habits that are a subset. So what typifies the realm is the habit base, the shared guidelines of habit. Why that happens, I have no idea. That's just the definition of the register of activity. Why does reality seem like this as opposed to some other way? I have no idea. I just know that it's happening. And I just know that in different registers of reality, you have the same scenario with slightly different variations and slightly different laws that would define that register. And the different registers are mapped out in Kabbalah quite eloquently. You know, you have the worlds essentially laid out in a ladder system from gross to subtle. And that's just an organizational pattern to allow you to see degrees of subtlety. But the operating system is pretty much the same in all of the worlds. It's dualistic. You have the least amount of dualism in Atzilut, the most amount of dualism in Aseya, and it's just a matter of how opaque and heavy and separate seeming the reification actually is. And you could always bring the level of reification in a world or a register or a realm down to empty space. In the world of Aseya, we have a completely opaque sense of open space. It's actually not open at all because it's filled with potential designations to places and times and things that are just waiting to be known. So those potential dualistic possibilities fill space utterly and completely, so much so that we can only even conceptualize space in terms of physical distances and depths. It's like when you watch Star Trek and the Starship Enterprise goes off into space and it's further and further and further. That's physical depth. That's imposing physical laws on space. That's not really what space is all about. That's just physical space, dimensional space. I'm not saying that dimensional space doesn't manifest. Of course it does. But that's not the essence of what Gnostic traditions mean when they talk about space. What they talk about is pure openness, not dimensionality, not distance. So vastness seen through the lens of the material eye only means depth and dimensionality. Vastness seen through the Gnostic eye is just pure openness that doesn't have the qualities of the three-dimensionally imposed habits of what it means to penetrate something and keep going distance-wise forever. Make sense?
Yeah, this sounds like in previous conversations where you talk about degrees of dualism in the world, and that you're even um, in a Saya we're dualizing in a way that's more familiar to a human in terms of dimensionality, temporality, etc. And then in absolute, you're still dualizing, but what you're dualizing about becomes a lot more subtle, and it gets down to the level of dualizing about conceptuality itself. Is that right?
Well, if we know what a klipa is, and we know that duality is just simply the making of klipas through reification, and these klipas appear in networks, in clusters, and these clusters fill the realms, then we can designate what the realms are actually doing by the degree of virulence or the degree of reification or the degree of density or opacity that exists in the various registers, from the most heavy, sealed up and contrived to the most open and seemingly free. But even in the world of Atzilut, there's still some shred of duality there. It's not completely non-dual, even at the highest possible level. They're all operating according to reification, either a lot or a little. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really just a ladder of reification that defines the worlds.
And you've also spoken about this misconception about the worlds as places that you can travel to, and that that's not actually the case at all, that they're all sort of interpenetrating at all times, right? That it's not like I can go to Atzilut. It's Isaiah and Atzilut and everything in between are all sort of present within each other like Matryoshka dolls.
Well, yes and no. No, in the sense that they're not separate places because they're not elsewhere. They're not other than here. But sitting right from this position, if I had the ability to make my mind subtle enough to move from one register into another register, I wouldn't have to change physical position. See, the whole idea that they're separate places is the idea that we're imposing physical dimensionality on space again. We think
Mm.
of these as somewhere other than here. We think of them as somewhere else because we're imposing our habits from the so-called material world onto space again, onto space-time. If we stop doing that, we realize that all of these registers are actually superpositioned and non-obstructing from each other. They don't obstruct each other. They're all completely available right here, right now, if you were mentally nimble enough to move from one to the other. That changing physical position or even temporal position doesn't apply. We think it does because that's our habit in the human realm. But once you move into the area of mysticism, you see that that's not the case at all. So what do you do is the question. Well, in contemplation, we do what the Fountain of Wisdom text suggests that we do. We understand the mass and density and solidity of these klipa networks. That's how we clog up the openness of space with not only our own conceptuality, but all the conceptuality that has ever existed of other beings. To break free of that simply requires that you see through it. You essentially achieve a level of transparency that dissolves it on contact. And the way that you do that is by studying the view and understanding the view intellectually, and then applying it with your concentrated attention. The Fountain of Wisdom refers to concentrated attention as kind of like a verb. It calls it streaming, right? The stream of your concentrated attention is always pouring itself out. If you make that directional, then it gets sealed within dimensionality. If you make it temporal, then it's only pouring itself out according to past, present, and future in time. If you make it conceptual, it gets locked into abstractions and ideas. But if you're free of all of these things, all of that phenomena that arises becomes transparent, and the concentrated attention pours out its streams, going nowhere, from no one, free of every possible obstructing quality that could be reified through identification. So that all the Klipa networks that want to seal you in registers of where are you, when are you, what are you, all of them just simply open on contact with the right view. That's the important thing. Now, if you allow this stream of concentrated attention, which goes nowhere, at no time, from no one, you enter into this phenomena in contemplation that we call pulling. But you're not pulling from anywhere at any time, and there's no you doing the pulling. The pulling is just sort of the innate, essential dynamism of the stream, essentially liberating itself from enclosure. And this turns the stream into a thread. In other words, it makes it very fine. It makes it very subtle. It makes it very flexible. And if you can pull the stream of concentrated attention outside of its habits, it literally penetrates the networks of klipas and opens them up on contact, meaning that the klipa shells dissolve. And this is what we're going to talk about here and in the next video. What happens when you could pull the stream of concentrated attention, of consciousness essentially, into fine, fine threads that become so fine that they could penetrate networks of klipas and essentially dissolve the shells on contact and liberate the sparks that are hidden within them. This is actually the essential technique of contemplation that this style of practice carries. I just want to make sure that you're with me on all these terms so far: stream and thread and shell. That you're good with that so far?
I get the idea of a shell and what a klipa is, and I'm I'm trying not to fall into the trap of thinking of this as too much of a technique and an activity in a sort of um consequential material way, right? Because if you're streaming and pulling, it's not like it's something you can just sit down and decide to do, right? It's something that happens in contemplation, but it's not like you're like switching on a light switch and all of a sudden you're streaming.
This is the difficulty.
Yeah.
You can sit down and decide to do it because you fall from doing it and fall back into habit and have to remind yourself to do it. So you definitely can turn it back on when it gets automatically turned off by your habit, the momentum of your habit. But it's a non-mechanical technique. It doesn't involve the steps and stages of moving anything or manipulating anything in a mechanical way. So there is a volitional point where you find yourself back in ordinary habits, not contemplating, and you remember to reinstate that which you had lost. And in that split second, attention concentrates, streams forth, and can be pulled simply by the innate dynamism inherent in the stream. And based on how good you are at this, the stream is pulled to great extents to become a thread. And in that instance, whatever arises, whatever klipa clusters or networks that are superpositioned and interpenetrating and mutually non-obstructing, that are like really a prison around you, in the human realm, to the extent that you could pull mind forth into a thread to penetrate what seems to be the solidity of reality. In that instance, based on your capacity to remember the truth of the situation, the actual opacity starts to dissipate. And it happens in a split second. It happens in a split second as you remember that this is a dream with no dreamer, and the dream itself has no substance, has no dimension, has no temporal limitations, and even its concepts are open. And the very space that presents the dream opens up from the inside out, simply through the pulling of the stream. The shells of the networks that all interpenetrate each other essentially become like a fog or a mist or a haze dissolving when the sun comes up in the morning and the rays of the sun just melt the fog away, except it could happen very, very quickly. Now, we're used to thinking of individual klipas, like we said in the last video that we did, kind of like a bubble. And if we understand the absolute density of the klipa networks, which want to make a klipa out of everything, and that's how knowing happens in the realm, you have bubble and bubble and bubble and bubble filling everything. So that's why we refer to the expansive space from a dualistic perspective as a foam. It's a bubble-filled foam. But unlike physical bubbles, these bubbles are not only next to each other, but going through each other, inside each other, without physical space providing barriers between bubbles. You could have infinite bubbles in every coordinate location at infinite points in time. Make sense so far? So what happens? Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, going back to the streaming and pulling. So it occurs to me that it's not that you're sitting down and performing something, it's that you're letting go of this klipa making habit, and the degree to which you can stop doing that and realize the nature of the ground is the degree to which the threads become so fine that they annihilate the shells, because they're comprised of pure awareness, which is naturally negates this klipa making tendency.
This is the really weird thing about this style of practice. It is neither doing something nor the absence of doing something. So you can't even say it's just purely a letting go, because if you tell people that this is a letting go practice, they're going to conceptualize letting go in a highly conceptual manner, right? They're going to make a very mechanical gesture out of letting go, kind of like the tendency will be to make it kind of like a form of relaxation, like you're dropping
catharsis.
Something. Yeah. You're stopping something physical or stopping something energetic. And it's not that at all. What you're doing is certainly stopping something, which is the momentum of habit, but there's tremendous dynamism in the pulling and the streaming forth, but it's not a physical motion that goes anywhere or does anything. The dynamism inherent in mind is very, very real. So you can't call it passive. It's not a passive thing because it needs participation. It needs active participation, but it's not a mechanical form of participation. It's not a participatory activity in the physical or even psychological sense. It's beyond even feeling. It's beyond, certainly beyond physical activity, thinking or feeling, or even ideas, because it's not a philosophy. It's not you're holding to a different idea. It is something that has to be cultivated. It's the most subtle of the most subtle aspect of the dynamic of your own mind, that once it understands the view intellectually, deeply enough, it can manifest that view, which is essentially the view of the ground, by recalling the ground's virtues. And one just simply has to practice this. You spend enough time struggling to understand intellectually what the ground represents. At some point, if you have enough talent and wherewithal to do it, those qualities just spring forth naturally by virtue of the fact that your mind is the ground in action. So everything that it does manifests the complete power of the ground, because without getting into personal identification, the ground is you, provided that you understand that there is no you. One would be tempted to say in this instance something very dangerous, which is essentially that you are the divine. But you don't want to say that either, because then you get into a theistic problem of identification, and you get locked into the I am. You get locked into the reification of the monad, and you identify with the monad, right? Essentially what that is the reification of open awareness. For another time, for another discussion, it essentially is the root point where what needs to be opened is just about opening, and it opens just enough that it could reify itself on the most subtle possible level and stops there. And that's how a monist view starts. That's another discussion for another time. What I'd like to discuss now is what happens when concentrated attention and its inherent streaming is pulled through the view into a fine enough thread that it could actually penetrate the networks of klipos that come up, and they could be of any type, right? Seemingly physical, seemingly dimensional, seemingly temporal, seemingly conceptual, whatever it is. At that point, when the shells dissolve, the black ether is accessed, and the black ether is called forth immediately, because the black ether and the dissolution are essentially the same thing. This is the natural openness of the ground, remembering itself. What does it mean that openness remembers itself? It can't be described. There's nothing there. There's no one to know. So essentially, you're talking about an apophatic level of realization where there is no one to know, no thing to be known, and that is being applied to the circumstance at hand. So essentially what happens is that the mind, in the wake of its unknowing, falls through itself. And this is literally what happens when the shells dissolve. Mind falls through itself in the wake of anything to grasp on. And this apophatic, I don't want to call it a descent. One does fall into it, but it's not like you're falling down, because we think of falling as falling down. Essentially, you're falling up. If you want to use the semiotics of the system, you're going beyond Keter at that point. So you're falling up even beyond the root of the I am. There's no one to know, no thing to be known. In that instance, that's really what the black ether does. And when you remember that model of a klipa that we spoke about last time, where we have a shell, the shell has an inward facing part and an outward facing part, and the black ether is where the two touch each other. That makes the shell. When you remember the black ether and realize the black ether in the shell starts to dissolve, what's trapped inside the klipa? The spark. So in that instance, the black ether and the spark become synonymous. They're not separate from each other. They're realized together in that instance. If you draw a klipa, you have the shell, the little spark inside, and the black ether embedded in the shell. Once you take away the shell, once you take away the periphery, there is no center anymore, because the center only has meaning in relation to the periphery. So once the periphery dissolves, everything is the center. That's how the spark is coaxed outside of imprisonment. And at that point, you literally brighten the foam that makes up the realm, which is nothing but interpenetrating networks of klipos, brightens simultaneously with each instance of breakthrough. And coordinate reduction to places and times and substances just falls away. Now, we know that this happens through our own effort, but rather than think about our own effort mechanically, we could think about our own effort alchemically. This is simply the sulfur of life force rising and essentially going through the restrictive salts that contain it. Those salts essentially melt and drip back down, but once those restraints are gone, where are they dripping into once they've melted? Because there's no more center and periphery. Once you take away the periphery, the center is everywhere, right? So that dripping goes into a heart, the center, which is the heart of the matter, but it's non-localizable. The heart is simply the midst of the totality of all things. And that's where the life force and the melted mercury salts coalesce. And that's where the philosopher's stone is born, and the philosopher's stone is refined the deeper you engage this process. Another way that this is generally described is that the life force rises, melts through the mercury salts, and the shefa of the mercury salts, which is toxic, enters into the equation and is essentially refined through the fire, burning off its toxicity the deeper it pushes through. And of course, psychologically, this means negative qualities being burnt off in practice. Practice is very uncomfortable. This goes against the grain of our habits, so it hurts. And as the toxicity burns off, that melted mercury salt is realized for what it truly is, the effulgence of the Or Ein Sof. And that effulgence falls to the heart, essentially the crown, the melted crown of Keter, through the rising life force, falls to the heart. And what coalesces there is what we're going to talk about in the next video. That's the formation of what will be the philosopher's stone, which is refined in the heart alchemically. So once you understand everything that I've said, you come to this really wild conclusion that yes, we're in a prison of infinite networks of klipos, associative clusters, and they oppress us completely with an absolute density of dualistic possibility. And that's where we think it's normal in the human realm. But those klipos, those are the mercury salts that actually melt to come back into the heart to be refined into the universal medicine. So the klipa networks are not an evil, horrible thing. They're actually a good thing. They give us the opportunity to break through restraints and refine a level of understanding which is glowing and brilliant and transparent and open. Yeah? You have any questions?
Are you referring to the shefa as toxic because it's got this pure awareness substance that is antithetical to our misconceptions about reality?
Yeah,
Why is it toxic?
yeah, it's only toxic to our misconception of reality. From the standpoint of our habits, it's perceived as toxic because it hurts. When the limitations start to melt, we don't feel well. It kicks up negative qualities that we don't like. That's the only toxicity that I'm talking about here.
So why is it that this process is painful anyway? I mean, I get on the one hand, a human being is obviously very attached to their to their conception of reality of being in space and time and thingness as we know it. So why is it so painful to give all of that up? You'd think it would feel liberating.
No, it's the momentum of habit. We become accustomed to a certain mode of being. And when we are forced to contend with a change in what we're used to, we're thrown out of our element. So of course it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to have to process the unfamiliar. The momentum of our habit gives us a sense of safety and a sense of comfort that defines us as people living in a place at a time. I mean, to yank the rug underneath the feet of that is highly disorienting and disruptive. So it just simply hurts to be disrupted in such a way.
Yeah, I remember you telling me something that your teacher often said to you was that comparing practice to something conventional like addiction, that addiction feels sweet in the beginning and awful at the end, whereas practice is awful in the beginning and sweet at the end because you're having to unmake all of these all of these habits that we're so accustomed to, like you say.
Oh yeah. The
Yeah.
toxicity of the melted mercury salts definitely becomes sweet because that's how bliss arises. Once you
Hmm.
work through the toxicity, it is literally bliss. But the way that you get there is pushing up against your limitations and your restraints to the point that you are wildly uncomfortable. And this is where you very quickly realize how much of it you can or are willing to want to handle. And when you're in a situation like, for example, a closed boundary silent retreat that you've taken on, and you're practicing to the point of discomfort, and it's just you there with your discomfort, it's just you there with the pain of this, every single practitioner will have the thought, what the hell did I get myself into? This is nuts. Because it's just not going away. You got to live with it and come out the other side. So this is part of the reason why there's all sorts of provisions in retreat for different practices you could do and durations of time that you've committed to. Because if you didn't have that boundary of saying a 3-year retreat, a 1-month retreat, a 1-week retreat, the minute this would come up, you would just simply stop.
Yeah, oh my God. And it's amazing how quickly and easily that'll come up because, sometime last year I was attempting these just single day retreats over the weekend. And I would call you up at the end of it and say, that was horrific. It was just utterly horrific. I felt awful. And just totally out of the blue, all of these negative feelings would come up and just hit you like a ton of bricks, and it's just sort of incredible how real that is, and you don't realize what's just sort of waiting in the wings for you until you actually attempt something like that.
Well, there's good news and bad news about it. The good news is that the greater the discomfort, the greater the momentum can turn to the bliss side. And when you have the discomfort, you know that you're sure as hell melting something and something's being kicked up. So you know that there's some success there. The worse you feel, the more potential success you actually have. That's actually the good news. The bad, that's the good news. The bad news is this scenario plays out on every possible level of breakthrough. Because, like we said before, every single world, every single one of the realms is composed of reification to some degree. So you have to go through this on subtler and subtler levels the entire time, which is why being a practitioner is really and truly not for everybody. But you're not exactly resigning yourself to a life of total misery either, because what happens is that there's an arc to the breakthrough where there's tremendous discomfort on contact and the liberation of the mercury salts as toxicity, but then you work with refining or heating the toxicity to the point that you actually transmute the way that your mind imbibes it. And upon transmutation or the realization of the transmuted substrate, it manifests as bliss quite quickly and almost violently. through the sparkling, scintillating quality of its usurping the space that used to be filled with all this crap. That same space that was dense and filled with conceptual reified constructs and klipa shells has now open. So tremendous energy has been liberated. It hurts at first, but as it hangs there and is heated to the point that it's transmuted, settling into itself through itself is immensely pleasurable. The biggest challenge of all of this is not how do I ride the wave of pain and get to the wave of pleasure, because those are ordinary designations. Ultimately, the whole alchemical practice is non-identification with reactions to either pleasure or pain. Ultimately, what you want to be concentrated on is the ground, which is unaffected by any of it. It's only your dualistic mind which thinks that it feels good or bad. So that's the part of your mind that ultimately is cited for dismissal from the very beginning, if you understand the view properly. So this is simply not a practice about feeling good or bad. Those are just byproducts. And ultimately, they're not really that important. They're just indications of a process that's going on. There's no way that anybody would sit through this unless they loved the divine more than they love their own feelings. Because it's too much of a roller coaster. You would just never want to do it. Even if it felt absolutely amazing at the end, what you'd have to go through at the beginning, like you said, would be intolerable. So the love of the divine has to be the missing ingredient of the transmutation that actually allows the whole thing to work. Otherwise, it's just calisthenics, mental calisthenics.
Well, what's that famous quote about the practitioner doesn't pursue opening up until the pain of remaining closed overtakes that of opening up and practicing? I forget the exact verbiage, but you know what I'm talking about, right?
I like what you just said. I don't know that quote, but I like what you just said. I mean, you pretty much described. Now, this was a teaching on Klipa networks. So hopefully, after all of this discussion about contemplation and practice, we have to realize that we are practicing with the associative clusters that fill everything everywhere in our lives. We are in a Klipa network right now. That's ordinary life for us. What are you going to do about it? The first thing that you're going to do about it is realize the absolute density of the clustering activity that makes the networks, that it is literally a solid, opaque mass of dualistic possibilities. That's a very frightening thought, unless you don't care. If you care, you're going to hear that and you're going to go, whoa, I thought this was ordinary life. No, you're in hell.
Yeah, this reminds me of I think the first or second talk we did with the symbol of the scorpion, and that we're taking the poison and transmuting it, and that's what we're doing with these Klipa networks, right? Like they are the poison, but they're also simultaneously the antidote that allows us to perceive the ground clearly.
Yeah, but not a lot of people are going to hear this message and really understand it, because the psyche can't see itself. The knife can't cut itself. If you explain this to most conceptually fixated beings, either they won't understand you, or they won't care, or they'll just say, so what? That's life. The knife can't cut itself. It can't see its own hell. It takes a real leap to understand the claustrophobia of ordinary habit patterns and conceptuality. It's completely claustrophobic, but most people think that it's no big deal. So
Yeah, so you're saying it takes a degree of opening up and some practice to even get to the point where you no longer want that claustrophobia and you perceive it at all, let alone wanting to do something about it.
I don't know. I don't know what it takes. I don't understand the process that makes somebody different enough to want to do something about the situation. I've always thought that people were either born that way with that curiosity or they weren't, but I don't know. There's a disagreement of, are practitioners born or are they made? I don't know. Sometimes people have bad enough experiences in life that their mind turns and changes and they start to become curious about things that they weren't before. And then they become practitioners. Other people start out great as practitioners and just peter off and go nowhere. I don't know. I really don't. So let's stop here and pick up with the next video to go deeper into this issue of interpenetrating clusters of klippas. And we will pick up then. Thank you very much, Sophia.
Well, one thing, Dave, you mentioned before that there's going to be. I think we ought to let people know that you intend for there to be a bit of a break between this video and the next one. Is that true?
I'm going to do one more video now, and that will be the next one. And then one more after that. So we have two more coming. And then I'm going to break for 2 years before I finish the rest of the long scroll.
Okay. Okay. This is news to me. All right.
Yes,
All right.
we have two more videos from this ending forward, and then we'll pick it up again in 2023.
Very good.
And thank you all for tuning in. Hi ho!
Hi ho.